the letter of James sitting right in front of us. And James is very concerned about whether or not Christian people are out there working. He really is. That is a huge concern of this letter. He wants to know that we're doing our spiritual duty. We're not just floating in the bathtub of grace, but are out there laboring for the Lord. I have a pet peeve, and I bet that a lot of you share this pet peeve with me. I get really annoyed with people who don't do what they say they're going to do. Doesn't that bug you? It just bugs me to death. I think of the mechanic, for example. I go to the shop to have something fixed on my car, and the guy says, "Oh, easy fix. We'll be done before noon." But great. Well, noon comes and goes, as does 1 o'clock and 2 o'clock and 3 o'clock. Then I call him up, and he said, "Oh man, it got so busy around here today. You know what? You'll be first thing tomorrow." Yeah, right. Have the same kind of experience sometimes with the plumber or the electrician, and with family members, and with friends. I used to have a friend. You notice how I say I used to have a friend. I used to have a friend, and I'd run into him around town, and he'd say, "Hey man, I'm so glad to see you. We need to catch up. Let's have lunch. I'll shoot you a text." I said, "Great, look forward to hearing from you." And a week or two goes by, no text. So I text him. And I say, "How about lunch?" And are you hearing me better now? Is this better like this? I turned off one of the mics. Okay. All right. So then I shoot him a text and I say, "How about that lunch?" And he comes back and he says, "Oh man, things are so crazy busy right now. I tell you what, why don't we do it after the holidays? Christmas." Okay. All right. So we get past Christmas, we're into January. And I shoot him a note and I said, "How about lunch?" And he said, "Man, you wouldn't believe how time's gotten away from me. Things are just moving. How about let's do it in the spring?" In the spring. And now you know why I use that friendship term in the past tense. A former friend. Don't you just get frustrated with undependable people like that? I think God does too. God so loved the world that He poured out that love in the cross of Christ to redeem and restore, to lift us out of this dark morass of the world, out of the emptiness and sin of this life, to embrace us with this fatherly love that overwhelms us with tender mercy and grace. And sometimes in the moment, we'll say, "This means everything to me. Oh my gosh, this is so powerful. It just means the world. My whole heart and soul are focused on this. It's the most important thing to me." But you know what, Lord? I lead a busy life. And trying to work in church every week and Bible study, as well as caring for my neighbor while I'm trying to care for my children and my spouse and my house and my job. Well, it's just a lot. Maybe in the spring when things slow down. Maybe in the spring. Don't we do that to God? I think we do. So often our love for Him, our commitment is kind of way down the totem pole. Everything else comes first. This morning in the letter of James, who's the brother of Jesus, became a primary leader in the Jerusalem church. You remember that? You remember Acts 15? There's that huge council that gets formed because they're having to deal with all this Gentile Jewish issue. And James, the brother of Jesus, is presiding at that council. St. Paul, when he's struggling with some issues about tension in the church, he goes to James for advice and guidance. But the only thing we have written from James is this skinny little letter. And he tells us at the beginning of it that he's writing to the Jews in the diaspora. What does that mean? Well, you remember after the northern kingdom was destroyed in 722 BC and the southern kingdom in 586 BC, a lot of Jews got spread all around, all around the world, that part of the world. And then later, a number of them got converted by Paul on his missionary journeys and by other Christian missionaries. And so James is writing to those Jewish Christians who are living out in a secular world. So he's trying to say to them, live out your faith. Live it out. Live out your faith in such a way that the people in that secular world look at you and see a difference. They look at you and they say, "Oh my gosh, there's a humility there and a love and a care and an earnestness that I just don't see anywhere else." Live out that faith is what James is saying. So you can understand, because he's writing to those people in that secular world about living it out, that he's very focused on actions, on working, on laboring for the Lord. He says that faith isn't real unless it translates into action. Faith isn't real unless it translates into action. He says, be doers of the word, not just hearers. Don't just sit around listening, and never doing anything with it. It's like that poem. You remember the poem by Edgar Guest? I'd rather see a sermon than hear one any day. I'd rather one would walk with me than merely tell the way. You know, that's what James is saying. He goes on to say, if anyone thinks he's religious, but he's not living out a life of love and care for other people, he's deceiving himself. If we think we're religious, but we're not living out a life of love and care for others, we're deceiving ourselves. Is there another water here? Can I have that? So, in chapter 2, which we didn't read today, but it's important, he says, faith without works is dead. Because if a person, he says, comes to you in need, and you say a little prayer over them, and you wish them well, but you don't do anything to care about the practical need that they're putting in front of you, then he says, what has faith mattered? If you have this great, grand, powerful faith in God, and there are people out there suffering, and you encounter one of those people, you can't just say a little prayer, pat them on the head, and wish them well. Why aren't you caring about the practical need? Laboring for the Lord. When I was young, my father had this gruff old fellow who worked for him. His name was Jerry, and he talked like this. He had a really rough old voice. He probably smoked forever. But anyhow, Jerry, tough old dude. And when I was a teenager, I got a job in a nice air-conditioned office. And I was working at the front desk. And during that summer, I ran into Jerry around town. And Jerry wanted to know what I was doing for the summer. And I said, I got a job. I'm working. And he said, let me see your hands. Let me see your hands. Well, they're my nice, smooth, air-conditioned hands. There they are. He looked at my hands, and he held up his hands covered in calluses. He said, you ain't working. You ain't working. You boy, you don't know what work is until your hands look like this. And I can imagine St. James liking Jerry a whole lot. I can imagine James saying to us, you say you're a Christian? Let me see your hands. Let me see your hands. Now, James was not well received by some Christians along the way. Not only in the early church, but through the years. Martin Luther particularly disliked James. You remember Luther, the 16th century reformer? You know, but he was dealing with an odd thing. The Catholic Church at that moment in time was all caught up in what Luther regarded as works righteousness. Have you ever heard that? Works righteousness, that you have this notion that I can make myself righteous before God by doing certain things. For example, I can care for the poor. I can work in the church. I can say 10 Hail Marys. I can pay a priest to do a Eucharist on my behalf. And then you know what? God sort of owes me, right? Look at all this grace I have created for myself. God owes me because I've been doing some big stuff down here. Well, Luther felt that smacked of paganism. And rightly so, because you remember the pagans had this idea that every day, you know, you had to win the favor of the gods. Because they might be in a bad mood today. You know, they might be mad at you because of something yesterday. So you've got to earn their appreciation and respect. And how do you do that? Well, you give lavish gifts. That's one way. You pay for some really good incense to burn. They're smelling it. Puts them in a better mood, right? You know, you sacrifice a costly animal, you know, for them. And you flatter them about how powerful they are and how good their character. But Luther says, our God is not a pagan God. This is the one and only God of Jesus. And he says he loved us while we were yet sinners. He was already predisposed to love us before we ever did a single thing. He already wanted good things for our lives. You don't do good deeds to get God to do what you want Him to do. It's because we experience the unmerited love of God, because we, in our lives, experience this amazing grace and love and tenderness that we do not deserve. And it causes us to want to do things, not doing things to earn that, but doing things in response to it. Luther preached sola fide, faith alone, making the point that there is nothing we can do, not one doggone thing, to earn the grace, love, and mercy of God. God loved us first, poured out His love in the cross of Christ, and all we can do is respond to that gift with faith. He extends the hand in the cross, and we take that hand. So you know what? When Luther did his translation of the Scriptures, he put the book of James all the way in the very back. I'm not kidding. Not just in the back, behind the book of Revelation. But you know where those little white pages are at the very back? Behind all that. No kidding. All the way, he didn't like Hebrews or Jude or Revelation either. But he particularly disliked James. He couldn't leave it out of his translation because it was already established as an authoritative book of the Bible. But he put it way back there because he didn't want to encourage anybody to read it. And I understand, because he was at a particular moment in time where there was this huge stress on works righteousness. So what do you do in the midst of stuff? You overreact, right? He overreacted and said, I don't want anybody to read this James because they're going to get right back into that works righteousness stuff. But you know what? James makes perfect sense to me. He's never saying that we can earn the grace and love of God. What he's saying is, once we have experienced that grace and love, surely, if it's real, if our experience of that love and grace is real, we can't help but respond with love for other people. He's making the point that love is not a private gift, this gift of love and grace from God. It's not just there for our personal consumption and pleasure. It's there to be a life-transforming power. Not just to be consumed by us alone, but to be a transforming power that then makes a difference through our lives into the lives of others. It would sort of be like this. It'd be like falling in love with your spouse, your husband, your wife. You fall in love with this person, but then you don't ever do anything that they ask. In fact, you pretend that you don't even have a relationship with them. You're out there living independently, doing whatever you want, disregarding their needs, their hopes, their dreams. Is that love? And so he seems to be saying it should be that way with God. If you have this deep experience of love with God, then it's going to shape how you think, how you feel, what you do. We see this very point in the Sermon on the Mount. You remember, Jesus said, "Not everyone who says to me, 'Lord, Lord,' will enter the kingdom, but only he who does the will of my Father." I mean, you can say all the flowery words, you can get all the prayers right, but what are you doing? Later in Matthew's Gospel, Jesus is talking about that great judgment at the end of history where the sheep will be separated from the goats. Based on what? He says there, not based on what we believe, but how we live out that belief. Are you caring for the least of these? The poor, the imprisoned, the orphan, the widow? Is your faith visible? The prophet Amos in the Old Testament, do you remember him? He was a fiery prophet. And at one point, God says this in the book of Amos. He says, "I care nothing for your solemn assemblies. I have no use for your religious festivals, your burnt incense, the noise of your singing." You're not even getting the hymns right at the beginning of the procession. I have no interest in any of that. That sounds so harsh. Why is God saying that to the Israelites? Because he was seeing at that moment in time no love among his people, no care for those in need. He's seeing arrogance and unforgiveness and greed and selfishness. And he's saying, you know what? You can worship in all those lovely ways all day long, but it means nothing if you're not living it out. Now, for we who come from an Anglican background, That's stepping on our toes, isn't it? Because we love our liturgy. And I love it. I do. I love the beauty of it. I love the order, the structure of it. I love the history of it. And I think God can use this liturgy to shape our hearts and minds as we process across down the aisle and we bow our heads as it passes. As we acknowledge that there's something more holy than we in this place, and that's the very presence of God. As we stand for His gospel, as we kneel in prayer, as we humbly come forward to receive the broken body of Jesus into our hands and take it into our own bodies. God can use that. But it can never become an end in itself, just liturgy for liturgy's sake. I remember some years ago reading in the Boston Globe newspaper this interview with this fellow who is a non-believer. Doesn't believe any of it. But he says he loves going at that time to the Episcopal Church because he said it's like watching a beautiful ballet. It's just so lovely and moving. I'm thinking, oh my gosh, that's all it is? Just a beautiful ballet? Surely not. Surely God is using it for a greater purpose. Now, I know you've heard me say more than a few times that you can't just regard church as a big bathtub of grace in which you come to soak once a week, right? Just floating in the grace of God. But you know what? That's not entirely true. Sometimes I exaggerate, you know that. Not entirely true, because I think there are times in life when we've gotten beaten up. Life has been harsh and difficult. And we're hurting and feeling misused and confused and alone. And we come to the church for love and forgiveness and healing. And there's nothing wrong with that. But there is a hope that we meet God in church through His Word, through the actions of divine worship. And there He loves us and He heals us and restores us so that He might then use us for the good of others who are hurting out in the world. I think of our lives like a jagged rock in a creek. You know? We've got all these sharp edges because of all the things that have happened in life. The hardships and disappointments, the angers, the betrayals. But then we come to worship week after week. And God's Word, through all the actions and words of worship, wash over us and wash over us and wash over us like that water in that stream, smoothing out all those jagged places that we might become this smooth, loving, grace-filled representative of God, of His love and goodness. When you pray, are you praying to try to get God to do your will? Or are you praying to know His will? You know, a lot of times I think we're like the teenager who is determined that he's going to talk his mom and dad into letting him do what he wants to do. You know, he'll wear you out, trying to convince you that this is the thing. Do we do that in prayer? Are we just trying to wear God out? Are we trying to talk Him into something? Or is prayer about trying to listen and to give ourselves in submission to the will and purpose of God? How about church? What is it about? Are we coming here to get credit? You know, for God, I hope you're paying attention to this, because I'm here today. And you know what? It's Labor Day weekend, but I'm here. I'm here. Write it down. Is it about that? Credit? Is it because it's a bit of entertainment for the week? Is it to create a friend base? Is it to network with other people for the sake of your business? Or are we here to encounter the mystery of the living God? The mystery of the broken body of Christ. To hear God's voice in His Word that's read and proclaimed. To submit anew to His loving purposes. To be renewed in our faith. So that we go out of here refreshed, restored. Living out again that life of Christ. Now here's another thing about Anglicans. We're a prideful bunch. To be honest, we are. We have great pride in the fact that we're a learned crowd, you know? We're just an educated bunch. And oftentimes we look down on other denominations as not quite as intellectually capable as we are, right? There is that little snobbishness. But boy, if that isn't a slippery slope, getting all puffed up with our own knowledge and understanding, so that knowledge ends up having no purpose beyond itself just knowledge for knowledge's sake. You remember John Wesley? Another very well-educated Anglican. He's regarded as the creator, the founder of the Methodist Church. He'd turn over in his grave at that, because he never left the Anglican Church. 1791, he died a faithful Anglican. Methodism is something that happened that he wasn't after. Don't tell your Methodist friends that. But you know what? What he was doing is he was trying to help his beloved Anglican Church have a deeper faith and a greater sense of service out in the larger world. That's all he was after. It's like, okay, we're closed up in our beautiful churches while people are starving in the streets. There was horrible poverty in England at the end of the 18th century. There was alcoholism rampant, especially among the poor. Debauchery of every sort out in the streets of London. And he felt, gosh, we've got this big, beautiful, powerful Anglican church on every corner. We need to be out there doing something for the sake of Christ. Now, he didn't always think that way. He, like his father and his brother, was an Oxford-educated Anglican priest and was pretty snobby about that reality. He was among the best of the best. But you know what happened to him? He made one and only visit to the colonies, to America. And when he's on that ship coming over, there are a whole bunch of German Moravians on the ship with him. Moravians, you know, are a very evangelical group of Christians in that day. And there's a huge storm at sea. And they think they're truly going to lose their lives. Enormous fear, much prayer. And they got through it. And afterwards, they're still on the ship and they have a conversation about what it means to trust God. And the Moravian pastor, not knowing Wesley, says, "Sir, do you know Jesus Christ?" And Wesley, an Oxford-educated Anglican priest, was insulted. "Do I know Jesus Christ?" he said. "He's the second person of the Trinity, the Logos, the Word made flesh, God incarnate on the earth." And the Moravian quietly said, "Sir, I'm not asking if you know about him. I'm asking if you know him in your heart and in the living of your life." And that really hurt Wesley. It was a slap in the face that stayed with him. In the coming weeks and months, he's stirring that around in him over and over. I'm not asking you if you know about him. I'm asking you if you know him in your heart and your life. And so in all of his praying and his scripture studies and worship in the coming months, he's thinking about that. He gets back to England. And because of that, he has an experience that the Methodists point to over and over, where his heart was strangely warmed. That's a big deal for an Englishman, to have his heart strangely warmed, right? His heart was strangely warmed. He came to know Jesus at a different level. And that's when he began to take out into the streets, proclaiming the gospel more boldly, calling people to be more faithful in caring for others. My cousin, the one I refer to sometimes, who's a priest in South Carolina, he's always been a bodybuilder. Always, since early days. He played football in high school, football in college, and all of his adult life he's been benching like right at, 400 pounds. I mean, this huge amount of weight on a bench press. And I could not begin to touch him on that bench press. It would kill me. But you know what? I can outrun him. And I can outbike him. And some years ago, he came to visit me, and I said, "You want to play tennis?" He said, "Yeah." I said, "Well, let's just grab a couple bikes and ride over to Forest Meadows. We can play over there." He says, "Close by?" I said, "Oh, yeah." Good. So we got our bikes, We ride through Killarn, down Killarney Way, across Thomasville Road, into Maclay Gardens, all through there, around that Lake Overstreet Trail, up and down, around and around, and then over to Forest Meadows. And we get off the bikes, and he's... It was a lovely game of tennis, let me tell you. I mean, I destroyed him in tennis. Because while his upper body is powerfully developed, those little legs are flimsy and weak. Because he's never cared about developing that part of his body. Sometimes I think that we're like that in the Christian church. We have been very attentive to knowledge and understanding, to right belief. We take a lot of Bible studies. We pay attention to sermons. We listen to Christian podcasts. We go to Christian retreats and conferences and lectures, just building up all that knowledge. But how often do we do anything to strengthen our spiritual body? So the balloon is not for a birthday. It's the only one I could find. So this balloon is us. It's to remind us of my cousin and us. We get a big head, right? As Christians, we get this big head just full of knowledge. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges, Ruth, Samuel, all this Bible studies, classes, lots and lots of knowledge. But then we have this flimsy, little weak spiritual body because we have not worked that part of our Christian faith. We've not lived it out. We've not walked it out. We've not used our hands, our feet, our voices to serve others beyond ourselves. So what I'm saying is, I'd like for Christianity, woke you up, didn't it? I'd like for Christianity not to be a head game. Not to be a head game. But to be a life that's lived out. James says, don't just be hearers of the gospel, be doers of the gospel. Amen.